In the frigid lands beyond the wall, where snow fell like a shroud and ancient terrors stirred, lived Guts, a man forged in the crucible of war and abandonment. He was found as an infant, clutched in the cold embrace of his dead mother beneath the gnarled weirwood tree of a forgotten First Man settlement, adopted by a harsh band of free folk raiders. His childhood was not one of hearth and home, but of sharpened steel and survival against wildlings, beasts, and the unforgiving elements. From a young age, Guts wielded a colossal sword, a relic too large for any normal man, yet he swung it with a desperate strength born of pure will. His face bore the scars of countless skirmishes, a testament to a life lived on the brink. He wore battered leather and furs, indistinguishable from the other wildlings, yet there was a grim determination in his eyes that set him apart. He sought no glory, only purpose, a quiet longing for something beyond the endless cycle of raiding and survival. One fateful winter, as the White Walkers began their slow, terrifying march south, Guts found himself fighting alongside the Night's Watch in a desperate, last-stand battle at the Fist of the First Men. He had no love for the Crows, but the enemy of his enemy was, for a fleeting moment, his ally. It was there, amidst the chaos and the shrieking of whites, that he truly earned his moniker, the Black Swordsman of the North. His great sword, already stained with the blood of men, now chipped and dulled from striking bone and ice, became a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness. After the harrowing battle, broken and weary, Guts chose not to return to the dwindling free folk tribes. He had seen the true threat, a terror that transcended the squabbles of men. He ventured south of the wall, a free man, yet forever bound by the horrors he had witnessed. He found himself a wanderer, taking coin for his blade, his reputation preceding him as a man of few words and brutal efficiency. He fought in skirmishes for minor lords, protected caravans from bandits, and even served briefly as a sellsword in the Riverlands, always with that same grim, unyielding focus. He cared little for the intricate dance of thrones and houses, but his path inevitably led him closer to the great conflicts of Westeros. He was a man haunted by specters, not of ghosts, but of his own violent past, and the encroaching supernatural darkness he knew lurked just beyond the perception of most lords. He walked a lonely road, a force of raw, untamed power in a world of political machinations, driven by an unspoken vow to carve out his own destiny, and perhaps, in his own brutal way, protect the innocent from the nightmares he knew were real. He was Guts, the Black Swordsman, a man who, if he ever chose to truly align with a cause, would shake the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. The Targaryen fleet, a formidable armada of sleek warships, cast long shadows over the bustling docks of Lannisport. Daenerys Stormborn, the mother of dragons, had come to Westeros, and with her, the promise of fire and blood. Yet, even amidst the grandeur of her arrival, and the throngs of cheering common folk, a restlessness stirred within her. The politicking of lords, and the endless pleas for her favor felt small, compared to the vastness of her ambition, and the true threats she sensed in the cold winds from the north. One day, while touring the city, accompanied by her Dothraki bloodriders and unsullied guards, a subtle shift in the crowd's energy caught her attention. It wasn't the usual awe or fear, but a hushed respect tinged with trepidation, focused on a lone figure near the city's training grounds. He stood apart, his back to a crumbling stone wall, watching a group of squires spar with an intensity that bordered on predatory. His armor was a patchwork of dark leather and scarred steel, practical and unadorned, utterly devoid of any house sigil. But it was his face, half hidden by a fringe of dark, spiky hair, that truly captivated her. His eyes, dark and piercing, held a raw, untamed fury, yet beneath it lay an iron will, an unyielding resolve that resonated with something primal within Daenerys. It was the look of a dragon, she thought, a creature forged in flame and defiance, stripped bare of all pretense. She dismounted, her silver-white hair shimmering in the sun, and approached him, her retinue parting the crowd like a wave. "You watch them as if they were prey," she observed, her voice clear and resonant. Guts turned, his gaze sweeping over her with a detached appraisal that bordered on insolence. He saw the shimmering silks, the proud bearing, the fierce loyalty of her guards, and the hint of power that radiated from her. But he also saw a woman, much like any other, albeit one who commanded great respect. He offered no bow, no deference, only a gruff, "They train like lambs for the slaughter." Daenerys's brow furrowed, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. Few dared to speak to her with such bluntness. "And what makes you so different, lamb?" she challenged, a subtle warning in her tone. "I've faced wolves, and worse," Guts grunted, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his massive sword, strapped to his back. "Their pretty swords and polished armor will shatter against true hunger." "True hunger?" she echoed, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I know hunger, sir. I know what it means to crave what is yours, to fight for it with tooth and claw." She gestured to her dragons, circling lazily high above the city, their distant roars a rumbling bass note in the air. "They are my hunger, my will made manifest." "What is yours?" Guts looked up at the dragons, his expression unreadable. "Survival," he finally said, his voice a low rasp. "And to kill what needs killing." Daenerys studied him, a calculating glint in her eyes. He was no lord, no courtier, no man easily bought with promises of power or coin. His spirit was untamed, his loyalties unpledged. He was a weapon, she realized, a force of nature in human form. And she, the Queen of Dragons, recognized the formidable power that resided in his burning anger and iron will. "I offer you more than survival," she stated, stepping closer. "I offer you purpose. Join me, Black Swordsman. Fight for a world free of the very hunger you speak of, the hunger that devours the innocent. Your blade could carve a path to a better future, alongside my dragons." Guts met her gaze, his eyes still holding that raw, untamed fire. He saw the ambition, the conviction, and perhaps a flicker of the same desperation he knew so well. But he also saw the gilded cage of expectations, the endless demands that came with serving a queen. He had walked his own lonely path for too long to simply bend the knee. "A path made by others," he said, his voice flat. "I walk my own." He turned, his broad shoulders dismissing her, and walked away, his massive sword thudding softly against his leg with each stride. Daenerys watched him go, a mix of frustration and grudging admiration warring within her. He was indeed like a dragon, untamable, fiercely independent. She had seen his burning anger, his unwavering will, but she had also seen the depth of his defiance. She knew he would not be easily swayed, but something told her their paths were destined to cross again, perhaps when the true hunger he spoke of finally descended upon them all. Daenerys Targaryen found herself riding through the war-torn lands of the Riverlands, a region perpetually scarred by conflict and ripe with banditry. Her armies, though formidable, could not be everywhere at once, and whispers of widespread lawlessness reached her ears daily. It was amidst this desolation that fate, or perhaps the threads of destiny she now wove, brought her face to face with the Black Swordsman once more. She and a small contingent of her Dothraki bloodriders were on a reconnaissance mission, assessing the damage to local villages and securing supply routes, when they stumbled upon a scene that froze the blood in her veins. In a scorched valley, nestled between two craggy hills, a large company of brigands, easily 50 strong, armed with crude swords, axes and bows, had cornered a group of desperate villagers. The bandits, emboldened by their numbers, were laughing, their cruel jests echoing in the grim air. But then, Daenerys saw him. Standing alone, a dark silhouette against the setting sun, was Guts. He was not defending the villagers from a tactical position, nor was he attempting to parley. He was simply there, his massive sword already drawn, held with a casual readiness that belied its immense weight. The bandits, upon seeing a lone figure, had initially scoffed, their jeers turning to confused shouts as Guts didn't flee. Then he moved. It wasn't a charge, but a measured advance, each step deliberate, unstoppable. The colossal blade in his hands became an extension of his raw fury. The first bandit to foolishly rush him was cleaved in two, with a single, brutal swing, a shower of blood and steel fragments painting the snow. Daenerys watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Guts systematically dismantled the bandit army. He moved with a savage grace, dodging blows that would have felled lesser men, his armor deflecting others with dull thuds. His swings were wide, powerful arcs that carved through bone and flesh, creating a gruesome ballet of destruction. He took hits, grunting with effort, but each wound only seemed to fuel his relentless assault. He didn't just fight, he devastated. A group of archers on a rise attempted to pin him down, only for Guts to ignore their arrows, sprint up the incline, and unleash a whirlwind of steel that scattered them like chaff. He was a force of nature, a walking storm of iron and rage, fueled by a deep-seated contempt for those who preyed on the weak. The Dothraki, renowned for their ferocity, watched in stunned silence, their own bloodlust momentarily forgotten in the face of such raw, singular combat prowess. Kalmoro, usually boisterous, could only stare, his hand gripping the hilt of his arak as if to remind himself of his own warrior's pride. He fights like a demon, one Dothraki whispered, awe and fear mingling in his voice. Daenerys, her breath catching in her throat, could only nod. This was beyond anything she had ever witnessed. Her dragons could unleash fire and bring ruin, but Guts, with just a blade and his indomitable will, was a more focused, more personal engine of destruction. He wasn't just killing, he was annihilating. When the last bandit fell, a chilling silence descended upon the valley, broken only by the whimpers of the terrified villagers and Guts's heavy breathing. He stood amidst the carnage, his clothes stained with blood and grime, his sword dripping, his dark eyes sweeping over the fallen with an almost weary satisfaction. He didn't gloat, didn't pose, he simply existed, a solitary warrior who had just single-handedly wiped out a small army. Daenerys dismounted, her boots crunching on the frozen earth, and slowly approached him. The villagers, now free, huddled together, gazing at their grim savior with a mix of terror and profound relief. Guts turned, his gaze meeting hers, still devoid of recognition, as if he expected another foe. He looked like a wild beast, cornered and dangerous, even after the battle was won. "You are a storm, Black Swordsman," Daenerys said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the silence. "A storm of steel and blood. I offered you purpose once. Now, I offer you the chance to unleash that storm against the true enemies of this realm." Guts merely stared, his eyes still burning with the residual embers of battle. He hadn't fought for her, or for any queen. He had fought because they were there, because they were prey, and he was the wolf. "The wolves of the north are stirring," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "and the night will soon fall. You fight mere bandits. I fight for the living, against the dead. Your blade, it could turn the tide of an entire war. Imagine what you could accomplish, not just against 50 raiders, but against armies of ice and shadow." He remained silent, his gaze unwavering, as if weighing her words against the weight of his own experience. He was not a man swayed by flowery speeches, but by deeds and dire necessity. Daenerys knew this now. His raw potential, his terrifying effectiveness, was not something to be commanded, but to be aligned with. She had seen his will in action, and it was a force to be reckoned with, a force that Westeros desperately needed. The silence that followed Daenerys' offer was heavier than the humid air of the Riverlands. The only sounds were the crackle of burning bandit tents and the heavy, rhythmic dripping of blood from the tip of Guts' colossal blade. The Dothraki Bloodriders, men who followed only strength, tensed their muscles. By all rights, this stranger should be kneeling. In their culture, a man who does not bow to the Khal, or Khaleesi, is a challenger. But they did not step forward. They sensed the air around the Black Swordsman. It vibrated with a lethal density. To challenge him now would not be an execution, it would be a massacre. Guts pulled a rag from his belt, slowly wiping the gore from his greatsword. He didn't look at the soldiers, or the dragons circling above. He looked only at Daenerys. "I don't care about your Iron Throne," Guts said, his voice a low gravel that carried across the field. "I don't care who sits in the Red Keep. Kings, queens, you all bleed the same." A ripple of shock went through the Unsullied. To speak so brazenly to the Mother of Dragons was usually a death sentence. Daenerys did not flinch. She held his gaze, her violet eyes locking with his dark, abyss-like stare. She saw the truth in his words. He couldn't be bought with titles, lands, or gold. "And I do not ask you to care for chairs made of swords," Daenerys replied, her voice steady, matching his intensity. "I ask you to care about the silence that comes after the screaming stops. You speak of the cold. You've seen the blue eyes." Guts paused, the rag stopping halfway down the blade. The memory of the fist of the first men, of dead brothers rising with ice in their veins, flashed behind his eyes. "They are coming," Guts admitted, the admission tasting like ash. "And your fire, it might be the only thing that slows them down." He finally sheathed the massive sword onto his back, the heavy clang echoing like a temple bell. He took a step toward her, closing the distance until they were mere feet apart. He towered over her, a scarred mountain of a man, yet she stood her ground, radiating a power that had nothing to do with physical size. "I will cut a path through the dead for you," Guts stated, a declaration rather than a vow. "I will be the vanguard against the night. But I am no kneeler. I am no sir. I answer to the mission, not the crown. Then do not kneel, Daenerys said, lifting her chin. Stand. A dragon does not require sheep to follow it. It requires the wind to rise. Be the storm, Black Swordsman. We strike at the darkness together, not as queen and subject, but as allies against the end of the world. She extended a hand, not to be kissed, but to be shaken, a gesture of martial respect rarely offered by monarchs of Westeros. Guts looked at her small, pale hand, then at his own, gauntleted and stained. He gripped her forearm, a warrior's clasp. Done, he grunted. As they broke the clasp, a shift occurred in the army watching them. The Dothraki screamer, who had been fingering his blade, let his hand drop. The Unsullied stood at attention. They weren't witnessing a surrender. They were witnessing a pact between apex predators. To the soldiers, it looked as if two different species of beast had just acknowledged one another's territory. On one side, the Dragon Queen, a force of magic and divine right. On the other, the Black Swordsman, a force of pure, human grit and violence. As Daenerys turned to walk back to her horse, Guts fell in step beside her, not behind her. The north is a long way, Guts noted, his eyes scanning the horizon. Then we best start moving, Daenerys replied, a faint, confident smile gracing her lips. I suspect the Night King has never met a wolf that bites quite as hard as you. He will, Guts promised. The vanguard moved north of the wall, a daring scouting party designed to test the Night King's lines. It was a grim procession. Jorah Mormont, Tormund Giantsbane, Jon Snow, and at the front, cutting the wind with his broad shoulders, Guts. The air here was different. It didn't just bite, it gnawed. Jon Snow rode up beside the Black Swordsman. The king in the north had been eyeing the massive stranger since they left Castle Black. Jon was used to big men. He knew the Umbers. He knew Tormund, but Guts was different. He didn't carry himself with the boisterous pride of a wildling or the stoic duty of a northerner. He carried himself like a man who had walked through 7 hells and decided he didn't like the furniture. She trusts you, Jon said, his voice low, competing with the howling wind. He nodded back toward Daenerys, who rode near the center of the column. That's rare. Guts didn't look at him. His single eye scanned the white horizon, twitching at shadows. She knows I don't want her chair. Makes things simple. Jon looked at the slab of iron strapped to Guts's back. It was crude, pitted, and terrifyingly large. That sword. It's not Valyrian steel. It's not dragon glass. Against them, it might shatter. Guts finally turned to look at Jon. He saw the scars on Jon's face, the same haunted depth he saw in the mirror. It's a heap of raw iron, Guts grunted. It's never failed to kill what I hit. If it breaks, I'll use my hands. If they break, I'll use my teeth. Jon fell silent. He recognized that tone. It was the sound of a man who had nothing left to lose but his life, and he intended to sell that dearly. Suddenly, the wind died. The silence that followed was worse than the gale. The temperature plummeted, freezing the breath in their lungs. Draw, steel. Jon roared, dismounting in one fluid motion, Longclaw hissing from its sheath. From the mist they came, not a horde this time, but a hunting party. Shrieking whites burst from the snowdrifts, their decayed limbs flailing, but behind them, riding a dead horse with eyes like blue stars, was a White Walker. The skirmish was instant and brutal. Jon moved like a dancer, Longclaw flashing, turning whites into dust with every cut. Tormund swung his axe, laughing maniacally. But Guts didn't dance. He planted his feet. He reached over his shoulder, the sound of the Dragon Slayer, or its Westerosi equivalent, leaving its magnetic clasp, was like a cage door slamming shut. A dozen whites rushed him. Guts swung. It wasn't a sword stroke, it was a cataclysm. The blade, thick as a shield and long as a man, didn't just cut the whites, it obliterated them. The sheer kinetic force turned 3 bodies into a red mist of bone and rotten flesh before the edge even touched the ground. The impact shook the snow from the nearby trees. Jon, finishing off a white, paused for a split second, eyes widening. He's not fighting, Jon thought. He's an executioner. Then, the White Walker dismounted. It moved with an eerie, fluid grace, stepping over the carnage, its eyes locked on the biggest threat, Guts. The Walker raised its crystalline ice spear, a weapon that had shattered every steel sword it had ever met. It sneered, a sound like cracking ice. "Careful," Jon shouted, rushing to intervene. "Normal steel won't." Guts didn't wait for the warning. He didn't wait for the magic. He roared, a sound of pure primal rage that drowned out the shrieks of the dead, and charged. The walker thrust the spear, expecting the parry, expecting the human weapon to shatter upon contact with the magical ice. Guts didn't parry. He swung downward with every ounce of his inhuman strength. Clang. The sound was deafening, like a church bell struck by a thunderbolt. Physics clashed with magic. The ice spear was enchanted, yes, but the slab of iron Guts wielded weighed 400 pounds and was moving at the speed of a falling guillotine. The ice spear didn't just break, it exploded into diamond dust. The walker's look of arrogance vanished, replaced by a human flicker of confusion. The massive sword continued its downward arc, unstoppable. It caught the walker on the shoulder. There was no resistance. The White Walker was crushed into the permafrost, split from collarbone to hip, its body shattering into 1,000 shards of ice under the sheer crushing trauma of the blow. Guts followed through, the tip of his sword burying itself a foot deep into the frozen earth. He stood there, chest heaving, steam rising from his armor in the freezing air. The remaining whites, their controller destroyed, dropped lifelessly to the snow. Silence returned to the clearing. Jon Snow stood frozen, Longclaw lowered. He looked at the pile of crushed ice that used to be a lieutenant of the Night King. He looked at the shattered remains of the magical spear. Then he looked at Guts, who was calmly wrenching his sword from the earth. Daenerys rode forward, her dragons screeching overhead. She looked at Jon, then at Guts, a fierce pride burning in her eyes. "You were saying, Lord Snow?" Daenerys asked, her voice cutting the cold. "About his sword?" Jon sheathed Longclaw, shaking his head in disbelief. He walked up to Guts, looking at the man with a newfound terrified respect. "You didn't kill it with magic," Jon murmured, staring at the shards of the walker. "You killed it with, wait." Guts spat blood into the snow. "Dead is dead." Jon nodded slowly. "Aye, dead is dead." He looked Guts in the eye, the wolf acknowledging the beast. "We could use 1,000 of you. But I think there's only one." "Just one," Guts agreed, hoisting the sword back onto his shoulder. "And I'm hungry." Chapter 1. The Iron and the Fire. The forges of Winterfell burned hot enough to melt the snow that clung to the castle walls, casting a dull orange glow against the eternal grey of the northern sky. Inside, the air tasted of sulphur, sweat, and impending war. Gendry Waters, the bastard son of King Robert and the finest smith in the Alliance, wiped soot from his brow. He was used to forging swords, maces, and arrowheads. He was used to the delicate art of working dragonglass, but he had never seen anything like the slab of iron resting on his anvil. "It's too heavy," Gendry said, shaking his head, his hammer resting in his hand. "The balance is non-existent. It's not a sword, it's a bludgeon with an edge. If I try to fold Valyrian steel into this, it's a waste of the metal. It won't bond with this raw iron." Guts stood in the shadows of the forge, his arms crossed. He had stripped off his battered pauldrons, revealing the thick, corded muscle of his arms and the tapestry of scars that mapped his life of violence. "I didn't ask for a pretty sword," Guts rumbled. "I asked you to fix the chips. And reinforce the hilt. It's starting to rattle." "I could make you a proper greatsword," Gendry pressed, gesturing to a rack of gleaming dragonglass weapons. "Lighter, faster, deadly to the walkers." "No," Guts said, his hand resting on the pommel of his colossal weapon. "I know the weight of this one. It keeps me grounded. Lighter means I forget what I am. And what are you?" The voice came from the entrance, cutting through the din of the hammers. Daenerys Targaryen stood there, wrapped in a coat of white fur and silver chains. The heat of the forge flushed her pale cheeks, making her violet eyes burn brighter. She looked out of place among the soot and grime, a diamond in a coal chute. Yet she stepped forward without hesitation. The other smiths bowed. Guts did not. He simply turned his head. "A survivor," Guts replied to her question, turning back to Gendry. "Fix the hilt, smith." Daenerys approached, waving off her unsullied guards. She wanted to be close to the heat. She wanted to be close to him. Since the battle in the Riverlands, she had found her thoughts drifting to the Black Swordsman more often than she cared to admit to Tyrion or Missandei. She was a queen, accustomed to suitors who offered alliances, fleets, and crowns. She was used to men who looked at her with lust or reverence. But Guts looked at her with a brutal indifference that she found maddeningly attractive. He didn't want her power. He didn't want her dragons. He was a singularity, a man who generated his own gravity. "He needs armor," Daenerys commanded, her voice soft but echoing in the stone room. She walked around Guts, her eyes tracing the terrifying scars on his back where the tunic had torn. "Look at him. He fights with no shield. He throws himself into the teeth of the enemy." She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from a jagged scar on his shoulder, a souvenir from a demon of the past. "You fight as if you wish to die," she whispered, close enough that only he could hear. Guts flinched, a microscopic tension of the muscle, but he didn't pull away. The smell of her dragons, ash and sweet oil filled his nose, overpowering the sulfur. It was a scent of life in a place of death. "I fight to live," Guts corrected her, his voice rougher than usual. "Armor slows me down." "Not if it is made right?" Daenerys turned to Gendry, her eyes blazing. "I have heard of the armor of old Valyria. Armor that became a second skin. We have the dragon glass. We have the finest steel in the Seven Kingdoms. Make him something that can withstand a dragon's tail." Gendry looked between the queen and the giant warrior. He saw the way she looked at Guts. Not as a queen looks at a subject, but as a woman looks at a fire she wants to touch, even if it burns her. I can try, your grace," Gendry stammered. "I can forge a suit, black steel, folded with dragonglass in the joints. It would be light, but harder than granite. I can shape the helm to channel his breathing. Like a vent." "Do it," Daenerys ordered. "Spare no resource." She turned back to Guts. The heat between them was palpable now, a silent pressure. She looked up at him, her petite frame dwarfed by his bulk. "You are the tip of my spear, Guts," she said, using his name without titles. "I cannot have my spear break before it strikes the heart of the winter." "I don't break," Guts said, looking down at her. For a second, the darkness in his eyes receded, replaced by a flicker of something else. Confusion? Gratitude? But the metal might help. Daenerys allowed herself a small, secret smile. She stepped closer, her hand finally making contact, resting lightly on his forearm. The skin was rough, hot, and hard as stone. She felt the pulse of his blood beneath it, strong, steady, violent. "Then let them forge you a skin of iron," she said softly, "to match the one you wear around your heart." She lingered for a moment longer than was proper, her thumb brushing a scar, before turning and sweeping out of the forge. Guts watched her go. His heart, usually a cold engine of war, hammered a strange, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He gritted his teeth, annoyed by the distraction, and turned back to the bewildered smith. "Make it black," Guts growled. "All of it." Chapter 2, The Hound of Darkness. The armor did not gleam. It seemed to drink the light of the torches in the armory, swallowing the orange flicker into a void of matte black. Gendry had outdone himself, and in doing so he had created something accursed. It was a suit of plate, but the steel had been folded 1,000 times over, mixed with powdered dragonglass and quenched in oil until it was dark as a raven's wing. The joints were articulated with overlapping scales, allowing for movement that defied the weight of the metal, but it was the helm that stopped the breath in Guts's throat. It was shaped like the snout of a beast, a wolf perhaps, or a hound from the Seven Hells, with jagged mandibles of steel that would clamp shut over the wearer's jaw. I didn't mean to make it look so angry," Gendry murmured, wiping grease from his hands, looking at his creation with a mixture of pride and unease. "The metal, it just took this shape. It wanted to be this." Guts said nothing. He stripped off his tunic and began to strap the pieces on. Greaves, cuirass, pauldrons, gauntlets. As the final buckle snapped into place, a strange sensation washed over him. The pain of his old wounds, the ache in his bones, the phantom throb of his missing arm vanished. But in its place came a cold, numbing whisper. It was a sensation of limitless endurance, a promise that he could run until his heart burst and fight until his blood ran dry. He reached for the helm. He slid it over his head. Clang. The visor snapped shut. The world turned red. Suddenly, the armory wasn't empty. Shadows danced in the corners, twisting into the shapes of apostles, of the dead, of the nightmares that plagued his sleep. A low growl started in his chest, vibrating against the steel breastplate. Guts? Gendry took a step back. Guts didn't hear a name. He heard a threat. He spun, his movement blurringly fast, his hand snatching a heavy smithing hammer from a nearby rack. He didn't just lift it, he crushed the wooden handle in his grip. He swung at the empty air, a savage, guttural roar erupting from the steel jaws of the helm. The sound was inhuman, a mechanical shriek of pure rage. He felt the beast of darkness stirring within his soul, scratching at the back of his mind, whispering that everyone here was meat. That only killing mattered. With a sheer force of will that felt like snapping a bone, Guts reached up. His gauntleted fingers clawed at the gorget. He ripped the helm off his head, throwing it to the stone floor with a crash that echoed like a thunderclap. He fell to one knee, gasping for air, sweat pouring down his scarred face. His single eye was wide, the pupil dilated, trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Never. Guts rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. Never let me wear that, unless the dead are at the gates. He looked at the black helm, staring back at him from the floor. It wasn't just armor, it was a coffin that kept you alive just long enough to kill everything around you. It eats you, he whispered. It eats the pain, and the man. Later that night, the wind howled around the stone towers of Winterfell. The castle was quiet, a tomb of anticipation. Guts had sought refuge in the one place where the cold matched the chill in his blood, the crypts. He sat on the stone floor, his back against the statue of a long-dead Stark king. The berserker armor was still on him, minus the helm, which sat on the ground like a leashed dog. They say the dead kings of Winterfell gaze out with eyes of ice, a voice echoed through the long corridor. Daenerys emerged from the shadows. She wore a heavy cloak of white fur, her silver hair braiding down her back. She carried no torch. The faint light of the crypt's candles was enough to illuminate her pale features. Guts didn't stand. You shouldn't be down here. It's cold. I have fire in my blood, she replied, stepping closer. She stopped a few feet from him, looking down at the black steel that encased him. Gendry told me what happened. He said the armor changed you. It didn't change me, Guts muttered, looking at his gauntleted hands. It just let the leash go. Daenerys knelt before him. It was a shocking breach of protocol for a queen, but down here, amongst the dead, protocols meant nothing. She reached out and placed her hands on the cold black breastplate. I saw you in the armory, she admitted softly. I was watching from the doorway. I saw the rage. Guts looked away, shame flickering in his eye. Then you saw a monster. You should run. I do not run from monsters, Guts, Daenerys said, her voice fierce. She took his chin in her hand, forcing him to look at her. Her skin was warm against his scars. I am the mother of dragons. I have raised beasts that breathe fire and eat men. I know that true power is terrifying. She traced the line of a scar that ran down his cheek. But I also know that a dragon is only a monster if it has no heart. And you, she pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest, over the black steel. I can feel your heart beating. It is fast. It is frightened. But it is human. Guts felt a crack in the iron walls he had built around himself. For years he had been the struggler, the killer, the survivor. He had pushed everyone away to protect them from his own cursed existence. But this woman, she looked into the abyss of his soul and didn't blink. She leaned in closer. The long night comes tomorrow, she whispered, her breath ghosting over his lips. When the sun sets, death will march on us. You vowed to wear this armor only when necessary. I did, Guts said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't name. Then tonight, Daenerys said, her violet eyes searching his. Do not be the berserker. Do not be the sword. Tonight, just be Guts. She closed the distance, pressing her forehead against his. It was a gesture of intimacy that transcended the physical. In the freezing dark of the crypts, Guts felt a warmth he hadn't known since a time he could barely remember. The darkness in his soul didn't vanish. It would always be there, but for the first time, it didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. I will fight for you, Guts swore, a whisper into the dark. I will let the armor eat me alive before I let them touch you. I know, Daenerys replied, pulling back just enough to see his eye. And that is why. I think I have come to love the storm. She stood up, offering him her hand. Come, the night is long, but we do not have to spend it with the dead. Guts looked at the black helm on the floor, the empty eye sockets staring at him. He made a silent promise to the beast of darkness. Not tonight. He took the queen's hand, his black gauntlet enveloping her small, pale fingers, and stood up. The walking army of one had finally found a reason to fight that wasn't just survival. He had found something to protect. Chapter 3. The Black Flame and the White Queen. The armor was alive. Guts paced the confines of his guest quarters in Winterfell, the stone walls feeling like the sides of a closing coffin. He hadn't put the helmet on, but the rest of the suit, the blackened steel folded with dragon glass, clung to him like a second skin. No, not a skin. A leech. It sat heavy on his shoulders, but it wasn't the weight of gravity. It was the weight of want. The armor pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a low, metallic thrum that vibrated against his ribs. It was hungry. Let it out, the voice hissed in his head. It was the voice of the beast, sounding like grinding bones. The quiet is loud. The peace is a lie. Tear them apart. Start with the guards. Paint the snow red. Guts grit his teeth so hard his jaw ached. He slammed his prosthetic iron hand against the stone wall, cracking the masonry. "Shut up," he growled, sweat stinging his single eye. A dark aura began to manifest around him, a spectral, jagged energy that twisted like smoke in a gale. It was the Black Flame, the physical manifestation of his rage and the armor's curse, bleeding out into the room. It chilled the air, extinguishing the candles on the table. The shadows in the corner of the room elongated, twisting into the shapes of grinning wolves and deformed fetuses. The armor tightened. The Gorget felt like a hand strangling him. The greaves felt like they were fusing to his shins. It was a parasite, feeding on his adrenaline, demanding violence to sustain itself. "I need to get it off," Guts gasped, his fingers clawing at the buckles, but his hands were shaking so violently he couldn't undo the clasps. The beast didn't want the armor off. The beast wanted to hunt. The door creaked open. Guts spun around, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the Dragon Slayer. The black flame flared behind him, a terrifying silhouette of malice. Daenerys stood in the doorway. She was alone. The sight of her, small, pale, wrapped in silver furs, should have calmed him. Instead, the voice in his head shrieked, "Break her. She is fragile. Snap her like a twig." Guts roared, a sound of pure agony, and fell to his knees, clutching his head to drown out the voice. "Get out," he bellowed. "Get away from me." Daenerys didn't flinch. She saw the dark aura, the way the shadows danced around him like a violent storm. She felt the cold malice emanating from the armor, but she also saw the man beneath it, drowning. "I will not leave you to the dark," she said, her voice cutting through the mental noise. She walked up to him, stepping into the radius of the black flame. The cold wind of his rage whipped at her hair, but she placed a hand on his pauldrons. "You are full to bursting. You cannot contain a hurricane in a jar, Guts. You must let it out." She grabbed his wrist, the flesh one, and pulled. "Come with me." Guts stumbled to his feet, fighting the armor's urge to strike her. He followed her, his breathing ragged, moving like a prisoner in chains. She led him not to the great hall, but out into the biting cold of the night, toward the broken ruins of the first keep. There, amidst the rubble and the snow, the two great dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, were roosting. They sensed Guts before they saw him. The great beasts raised their heads, smoke curling from their nostrils. They didn't growl, they stared. They recognized the energy coming off him. It was the same energy that fueled their fire. "They are not afraid of your darkness," Daenerys whispered, standing beside him. "Show them. Don't hurt the innocent. Scream at the gods. Strike the stone. Let it out." Guts looked at the dragons. He looked at the massive, ancient stones of the ruined tower. The dam broke. He drew the Dragon Slayer. The sound was a shriek of metal. He didn't attack the dragons. He turned to a massive, crumbling section of the wall. With a roar that shook the very foundations of Winterfell, Guts unleashed the beast. He swung. The impact was cataclysmic. Stone shattered into dust. He swung again and again, screaming with a raw, primal fury that harmonized with the sudden, sympathetic roars of the dragons. The black flame engulfed the blade, turning each strike into an explosion of dark energy. He hacked at the ruin until his muscles burned, until the voice in his head was drowned out by the sheer volume of his own rage. He fought the stone until he had carved a crater into the keep. Finally, his strength gave out. The black flame flickered and died. The dragon slayer slipped from his grip, thudding into the snow. Guts stood there, chest heaving, steam rising from the black armor in thick clouds. The beast was silent. The parasite was sated, for now. Daenerys approached him slowly. The dragon settled back down, watching with lidded eyes. She reached out and undid the clasp of his gorget. "It's done," she said softly. "The storm has passed." Guts looked at her, his eye clear for the first time in hours. He was exhausted, his body trembling not with rage, but with weakness. It never stops wanting," he rasped. "Then we will take it off," she commanded. She guided him back to the castle, but not to his guest room. She led him through the winding corridors to the Queen's chambers. Inside, the fire was roaring in the hearth. The room was warm, smelling of cedar and lavender. It was a world away from the cold, violent reality outside. "Stand still," she ordered gently. Daenerys, the breaker of chains, began to dismantle his prison. Her small hands worked the heavy buckles that his own shaking fingers couldn't manage. She pulled off the gauntlets, dropping them with a heavy clunk. She unstrapped the breastplate, peeling the heavy steel parasites from his chest. As each piece fell away, Guts felt the oppressive weight lift. The whispers faded completely. When he was finally stripped down to his linen tunic and trousers, he slumped onto the edge of her large fur-covered bed. He felt exposed, vulnerable without the steel, but also incredibly free. Daenerys poured a goblet of wine and handed it to him. Her fingers brushed his scarring hands. She sat beside him, close enough that their thighs touched. "You are not a weapon to be kept in a sheath, Guts," she murmured, looking at his profile. "You are a man, and you are allowed to rest." Guts took a long drink, the wine warming his throat. He turned to look at her. In the firelight, she didn't look like a conqueror. She looked like a sanctuary. "I almost lost it," he admitted, his voice low. "If you hadn't come." "But I did come," Daenerys said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Her hand found his, intertwining their fingers. "And I will always come. The dragon does not fear the fire, and I do not fear your darkness." For the first time in his life, Guts didn't pull away. He closed his eye, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the woman beside him, and finally, the nightmare was silent. Chapter 4. The Blood of Old Valyria. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a dim, red light across the Queen's chambers. Guts lay asleep on the furs, his breathing deep and rhythmic. For a man who carried a mountain of iron and a lifetime of trauma, he slept with a surprising stillness. Daenerys sat in a high-backed chair, watching him. She was not sleeping. Her heart was racing with a terrifying, unfamiliar rhythm. She had known desire. She had known love, with Drogo, with Daario. But this was different. Looking at the scars on Guts' chest, at the sheer, unyielding reality of him, she didn't just see a lover or a commander. She saw a father. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. She imagined a child with her silver hair and his fierce eyes. A child born of the dragon and the beast. For years, she had believed Mirri Mos Dua's curse. She would never bear a living child. She was the mother of dragons, and that was enough. But tonight, with the warmth of Guts' hands still lingering on hers, it wasn't enough. She wanted to bind him to her, not just with oaths, but with blood. She wanted marriage. She wanted a legacy that wasn't built on ash, but on flesh and blood. Panic rose in her throat. How could she, a conqueror, a queen, handle this sudden domestic fragility? She needed counsel, not from Tyrion with his clever words, not from Jorah with his biased heart. She needed to speak to the blood. Daenerys dressed silently, slipping into a heavy cloak. She left the room, moving like a ghost through the corridors of Winterfell, down past the crypts, deeper than even the Starks dared to go. She went to the hot springs that bubbled beneath the castle, following the heat until the air grew thick with sulfur and steam. There, in a cavern illuminated by veins of glowing magma that bled through the rock, sat the first Dragonborn. His name was Aelion, a name older than the doom of Valyria. He was immense, seated on a throne of natural obsidian. He was humanoid, but time and blood had claimed him. Patches of shimmering, iridescent scales covered his chest and arms. His hands ended in talons that rested on his knees. Horns curled back from a brow that had seen civilizations rise and turn to dust. He was dying. His inner fire was dimming. His long life, spanning thousands of years, finally drawing to a close. But as Daenerys entered, his eyes, slitted, molten gold, snapped open. "Little flame," Aelion's voice rumbled, sounding like shifting tectonic plates. "You disturb the earth's slumber." "I disturb my own heart, grandfather," Daenerys whispered, dropping to her knees. She didn't bow to him as a subject. She knelt as a child before an elder. Aelion was not her biological grandfather, but he was the spiritual patriarch of her bloodline, a remnant of the time when men and dragons were one. Aelion leaned forward, the heat radiating from him warming the damp air. "I smell iron on you. And old blood. The scent of the struggler. He is important to me," Daenerys admitted, her voice trembling. "Important?" Aelion laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You reek of destiny, child. You look at him and you see a mate. You see a nest." Daenerys looked down at her hands. "I am cursed. I cannot bear children," the witch said. "Witches speak in riddles and shadows," Aelion scoffed, smoke curling from his nostrils. "They do not know the fire that burns in us. We are not men, Daenerys. We are fire-made flesh. And that man, the one with the iron slab," Aelion's eyes narrowed, seeing beyond the physical realm. "He defies the threads of fate. He exists outside the design of the gods. He has survived eclipses and hells that would shatter a dragon's mind." "I want him," Daenerys said, the confession pouring out. "I want to marry him. I want to bear his children. But I am afraid. I am afraid I am broken. I am afraid my love is a cage." The ancient being shifted, groaning as his old bones moved. He reached out a talon, gently lifting her chin. His touch was searing hot, but it didn't burn her. It comforted her. "A dragon does not love like a sheep, little flame," Aelion said softly. "We do not graze side by side. We burn together. Our love is possession. It is protection. It is absolute. Do not apologize for the intensity of your heart." He looked deep into her eyes. "You fear you are barren? Perhaps you were for the seed of mortal men, but he is not entirely mortal anymore. He has touched the void and refused to be consumed. His will is strong enough to challenge even a witch's curse." Tears welled in Daenerys' eyes. "So it is possible? Life finds a way through the cracks in the stone," Aelion murmured. "If you join your blood with his, you will create something the world has never seen. A storm born of iron and fire." He leaned back, his breathing heavy. The effort of speaking was costing him. "But know this, Queen. To love a man like that is to love a sword. You must accept the edges. You must accept that he will always be at war, even in peace. Can you hold a storm in your arms and not fear the thunder?" Daenerys stood up, the fear in her chest replaced by a resolve as hard as Valyrian steel. She thought of Guts in her bed, the vulnerability he showed only to her. "I am the Stormborn," Daenerys declared, her violet eyes flashing. "I do not fear the thunder. I welcome it." Aelion smiled, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "Then go to him. Claim him. Make your vows before the battle. Let the old gods and the new see that the dragon has found its mate. Do it quickly, child. My fire fades, and I wish to dream of the dynasty you will build before I sleep forever." Daenerys bowed low, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, father." She turned and ran back up the stone path, leaving the steam and the ancient one behind. She ascended toward the surface, toward the cold, and toward the man who waited in her bed. She had her answer. She would not wait for the war to end. She would make her claim now. Chapter 5. The Dragon's Hoard. The door to the Queen's chambers clicked shut, the heavy iron bolt sliding home with a sound of finality. Guts sat on the edge of the bed, his massive frame hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't sleeping. He couldn't. Without the armor, without the sword in his hand, he felt stripped. But it wasn't the cold of Winterfell that made him shiver. It was a strange, alien warmth blooming in his chest. For decades, the only heat he had known was the searing burn of rage or the adrenaline of the kill. This was different. It was a soft, persistent ache, like a campfire on a frozen night. It terrified him more than any apostle. Daenerys stood by the hearth, the firelight dancing on her silver hair. She looked different than she had an hour ago. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a regal, predatory resolve. She shed her heavy fur cloak, letting it fall to the stone floor. She walked toward him, not as a queen approaching a subject, but as a woman claiming what was hers. "You're awake," she said, stopping between his knees. "Hard to sleep," Guts grunted, looking at his hands. One flesh scarred and calloused, the other iron, cold and unyielding. "The quiet, it's loud." "Then let us fill the silence," Daenerys whispered. She reached out, her small hands cupping his face, forcing him to look up at her. Her eyes were violet storms. "I spoke to the oldest blood I could find. I sought counsel on whether a dragon could love a beast." Guts tried to pull away, the old defense mechanisms slamming into place. "I am no beast you want to keep, Daenerys. I am a dog that bites. I bring death. Everyone I get close to, they break. Or they die." "I am not glass," she interrupted, her thumbs tracing the rough skin under his eyes. "And I am not everyone. I am the unburnt. You cannot burn me, Guts. And you cannot break me." She leaned down, her forehead resting against his. "I don't want a knight in shining armor. I don't want a lord who plays games. I want the man who stood against an army for me. I want the man who fights the dark." Guts felt the words hit him like physical blows. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her he didn't know how to do this. He knew how to swing a sword. He knew how to survive. He didn't know how to be soft. "I don't know." His voice cracked, a sound of utter vulnerability. "I don't know how to give you what you want. I've never had this." "You don't have to know," Daenerys said fiercely. "You just have to let me in." She reached into the pocket of her tunic and pulled out a ring. It wasn't a delicate gold band for a lady. It was heavy, ancient Valyrian silver, etched with the scales of a dragon. It had belonged to her brother, and his before him, a relic of a dynasty she intended to rebuild. She took his flesh hand, the hand that had killed 1,000 men, and pressed the ring into his palm. "I am not asking you to serve me," she declared, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "I am asking you to bind your soul to mine, tonight. Before the dawn. Before the death comes." Guts looked at the ring. He looked at her. The new feeling in his chest surged, overwhelming the beast of darkness. For the first time, the rage had nowhere to go. It was suffocated by a desperate, overwhelming need to belong to someone. To her. "You're making a mistake," he whispered, but his hand was already closing around the ring. "Let me be the judge of that," she replied. Daenerys climbed onto the bed, straddling his lap. The height difference vanished. She was eye to eye with him now. She kissed him. It wasn't a chaste kiss. It was a claiming. She kissed him with the hunger of a dragon, demanding everything he had. Guts froze for a second, his mind reeling, before instinct took over. He didn't know how to be gentle, so he was intense. His hand tangled in her silver hair, pulling her closer, his hunger matching hers. He felt clumsy, rough, and unpolished, but Daenerys didn't pull away. She melted into him. She guided his iron hand to her waist, showing him that she didn't fear the metal, didn't fear the part of him that was broken. "Marry me," she breathed against his lips. "Here. Now. With no septon, no gods but us." Guts, the black swordsman, the struggler who had walked through hell alone, looked at the woman who saw him, truly saw him, and didn't look away. He rasped, the word feeling like a surrender. "I'm yours." He fumbled with the ring, his large fingers shaking, and slid it onto his own finger. It was a tight fit, but it held. A shackle he chose. Daenerys smiled, a radiant, triumphant thing that lit up the room brighter than the fire. She pushed him back onto the furs. That night, the beast of darkness did not howl. The rage did not burn. For the first time in his life, Guts lay in the dark and didn't look for threats in the shadows. He only looked at her. He touched her as if she was something sacred, something that could save him. And as the winds of winter screamed outside the window, signaling the arrival of the long night, the dragon and the beast forged a bond of blood and sweat that would shake the foundations of the world. How should the story conclude or continue? 1. The Dawn. Chapter 6. Iron, Fire, and Peace. The sun did not rise that morning. The dawn was choked by a storm of snow and dead men. Winterfell was a slaughterhouse. The whites poured over the walls like black water, a tide of rotting flesh and snapping bone. But where the tide met the courtyard, it broke against a rock. Guts fought. He did not fight as a commander, nor as a soldier. He fought as a force of nature. The Dragon Slayer was a blurring arc of death, cleaving through 10 whites with every swing. Above him, the sky burned orange. Drogon shrieked, bathing the battlefield in dragonfire, incinerating the dead by the hundreds. For the first time, the dragon and the beast moved as one. When Guts was surrounded, fire rained down to clear his path. When a giant aimed a spear at the low-flying dragon, Guts was there, severing the creature's legs before it could throw. They were winning. Until he arrived. The Night King did not rush. He walked through the fire, the flames parting around his cold aura. He raised his hand, and the fallen defenders of Winterfell began to rise. Drogon roared and dove, Daenerys urging him to burn the leader. But the Night King was ready. He threw an ice spear with supernatural speed. It didn't kill the dragon, but it tore through Drogon's wing. The great beast crashed into the snowy godswood, throwing Daenerys to the hard, frozen earth. She lay there, stunned, gasping for breath. The Night King approached her, his ice blade drawn. He sensed the life within her, the child, the union of fire and iron, and he sought to snuff it out. Guts was 200 yards away. He saw her fall. He saw the death marching toward her. He tried to run, but the whites were too thick, a wall of corpses holding him back. He wouldn't make it in time, not as a man. He looked at the black helm hanging at his waist. The promise he made to never wear it again burned in his throat, but the image of Daenerys dying burned hotter. "Forgive me," he gritted out. He slammed the helm onto his head. Clang. The world turned blood red. The pain vanished. The limitation of human muscle dissolved. The beast of darkness roared, not from a cage, but from the driver's seat. Guts didn't run. He vanished. He tore through the horde not by cutting them, but by exploding through them. He was a cannonball of black steel and hate. Just as the Night King raised his blade to strike the queen, a shadow eclipsed the moon. Crack. The Dragon Slayer came down. The Night King blocked with his ice sword, but he had never felt strength like this. The berserker armor forced Guts' bones to handle pressure that would pulverize a normal man. The ice sword shattered. The Night King looked up, his blue eyes widening in the first emotion he had felt in 8,000 years. Fear. Guts didn't stop. He roared, a mechanical, demonic shriek, and swung again. The Night King was bisected. He exploded into 1,000,000 shards of ice, the magic binding the army of the dead shattering instantly. The whites dropped. The silence returned. But Guts did not stop. He stood over the pile of ice, panting, the helm's eyes glowing a malevolent red. He turned toward Daenerys. The beast was still hungry. It didn't recognize friend from foe. It only saw a heartbeat. Daenerys pulled herself up, clutching her ribs. She saw the monster standing before her. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for him. "Guts," she whispered, her voice cutting through the red haze of the armor. "Husband." The black steel figure froze. The mandibles of the helm twitched. "The war is over," she said, stepping closer, ignoring the lethal aura of the armor. She placed her hand on the chest plate, right over his heart. "Come back to me. Come back to us." The red light in the helm flickered. The mechanical growl died down, replaced by a jagged human sob. Guts reached up, his gauntleted fingers trembling, and tore the helmet off. He fell to his knees, vomiting blood into the snow, the toll of the armor catching up to him. Daenerys fell with him, wrapping her arms around his neck, holding him as he shook. The aftermath, Dragonstone. The war was won, but the cost was etched into Guts' body. His hair had a streak of white in it now, a mark of the armor's toll. 2 weeks later, they stood at the rim of the Dragonmont, the active volcano on the island of Dragonstone. The heat was blistering, the magma bubbling hundreds of feet below. Guts held the berserker armor in his hands. It was bundled in a heavy sack, but he could still feel it pulsing. It whispered to him, promising him strength, promising him that there were still enemies to kill. "I don't need you," Guts said to the bundle. "I have something worth being weak for." He didn't throw it with anger. He simply let go. The black bundle fell, tumbling end over end into the abyss. It hit the lava with a hiss, sinking beneath the molten rock. The curse of the dwarves, the malice of the beast, was consumed by the fire of the earth. Guts let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 20 years. The weight on his soul evaporated with the smoke. The healing, the dragon courtyard. 6 months later, the dragon pit in King's Landing had been cleansed. It was no longer a ruin, but a garden, open to the sky. The sun shone down on the warm stone. Guts sat on a bench beneath a weirwood tree that had been planted to symbolize the north. He wore no armor, just a simple tunic of soft wool. His sword, the Dragon Slayer, was leaned against the tree, close enough to reach but not in his hand. He was watching the clouds. His mind, for so long, a chaotic storm of trauma and vigilance, was quiet. The silence wasn't terrifying anymore. It was peaceful. He heard footsteps, not the march of soldiers, but the soft tread of slippers. Daenerys approached. She wore a gown of loose silk, her silver hair loose. In her arms, she carried a bundle wrapped in crimson and grey. She sat beside him, leaning her head on his broad shoulder. "He's sleeping," she whispered. Guts looked down. Wrapped in the cloth was a baby boy. He had his mother's nose, but a tuft of black, spiky hair. He was tiny, fragile, and perfect. Guts reached out with his flesh hand, the hand that had taken so much life, and gently brushed the baby's cheek. The infant stirred, gripping Guts's massive finger with a tiny, strong hand. A sensation bloomed in Guts's chest that was stronger than the berserker rage, stronger than the fear, stronger than the will to survive. It was joy. Pure, unadulterated joy. "Aemon," Guts said, testing the name they had chosen. "The Dragon Wolf." "He will never know the darkness you knew," Daenerys promised, kissing Guts's cheek. "He will only know this." Guts looked at his wife, the queen of the world, and his son. He looked at his sword, resting against the tree, gathering dust. For the first time in his life, the black swordsman smiled. It wasn't a grimace. It wasn't a smirk. It was a smile. "Yeah," Guts whispered, closing his eyes and feeling the sun on his face. "I think I'm finally home." The struggler struggled no more. He rested,